Thank you very much, Siobhan. Okay, so today I'm going to give a brief overview of some research we did that focused in on ESOPs in the food space. So this was a large-scale project that we received a generous grant to conduct. The purpose was to focus in on a particular industry and compare it to a similar group of businesses in that same industry. And so next slide. And there is a body of research for any data people out there, and you can read more about it at our website. But there's a definitely both an academic and a anecdotal line of findings indicating that there is a benefit to being an ESOP in terms of being able to weather the storms of economic ups and downs. So we focused in on whether having an ESOP helped companies weather the difficulties with some measures from the survey, whether or not workers benefit and kind of quantifying that, and turnover rates, and whether ESOPs had an advantage in retaining workers and attracting workers during this time. So basically this is, we ended up after a ton of work to get respondents. We were working with 258 privately held ESOPs in this space. We got a national firm, and this research was conducted November to March of last year and the beginning of this year. After working that list of 258, we ended up with 112 companies, 112 ESOPs in the privately held space, which is an amazing response rate. So I feel confident in talking about all the findings I'm going to talk about now, in that we got a really solid response in our ESOP group. And then the comparison group, we got 222 valid responses from a group that a group of companies without ESOPs in the food space that we then carefully matched so that we can make comparisons between the two groups. So notably, we look here, the ESOP group, we asked both the groups how their revenue compared to 2019. And the ESOP group was more likely to have seen an increase in their revenue by quite a bit. And what we believe that this research kind of backs up is, although all businesses were struggling and kind of having to pivot and maneuver, there may in fact be something about having that ESOP in place and the culture that comes with it that allowed them to pivot easier, that allowed them to pivot and thus kind of take advantage of opportunities that were happening during this rough time. So involuntary separation rate was roughly half that of non-ESOPs. So that means folks leaving and then having to be replaced, which is very costly for businesses. So this quantifies what we know anecdotally, that businesses kind of do better in retaining workers when they have an ESOP in place. And this provides evidence of comparing it to a closely matched group. And we see as well, the voluntary quit rates were also lower. So both low layoffs and quits were lower for ESOPs compared to non-ESOPs in similar circumstances. And here, this is a sort of attitudinal question that we asked of both groups. how they rated the performance of their workers during the pandemic and the shutdown. And so, as we would expect, there's not huge monumental differences between the two groups, but we do see in that excellent category that ESOPs were more likely to rate their workforce higher, and that we believe is kind of that underlying culture and all the sort of things that go along with having an ESOP. And for the most part, what we saw is just the ESOP group was asked this question: how did that ownership structure help them, or did it have a positive or negative impact? And so for the most part, they did not, even though it's there's a sizable outlay of payment in terms of benefits. It's not easy running an ESOP and running it well. This definitely wasn't seen as an impediment to handling the pandemic and taking advantage of the challenges and the opportunities. We asked them in an open-end question, so they, kind of the way they see it in their own words, and being able to adapt, being flexible, having the loyalty of your workers. These are the things that come to mind when they think about what that benefit of having an ESOP in place before all this happened was. And here more kind of in folks' own words, the way they describe the benefits of the ESOP. And for the most part, what we know from other research we've done is that having it in place and having that culture development before something happens is really important and really helpful. We've had folks say, like, in the good times, you hardly notice it. It's in the rough times that ESOP you can really see the difference, that you've kind of built up that culture that folks are like, how can we work together? How can we handle this together? It's kind of baked in, and it's hard to build on the fly when you're already facing tough times.
Nancy, you've got some great quotes in here. Can I read one of them before you move on?
Oh, of course.
Sure. So this one really stuck out to me. Being employee-owned allowed us to make decisions focused on doing the right thing for our business and our communities in the long term, rather than decisions focused on quarterly results.
That's actually from the folks that are knee deep in it, from our respondents in ESOP companies. So again, very clearly, as we've seen in a lot of other research, and this further quantifies that in these tough times, workers have better benefits at ESOP companies, partly because, as we've seen with in the open ends, ESOP companies get that your workers will be better able to be a great workforce if they're not worried about taking sick leave during the pandemic, or all the different ways that a solid benefit package can benefit the worker and the employer, and that looking at similar non-ESOP companies, so similar in size, similar in location, similar in subgroup, there's clearly an advantage there, and that pays off for both groups, for workers and employers. And it's most striking, this is one of the findings that really stood out for me in all of this, is that where you really see it is those smaller companies, smaller in terms of revenue. And that's where, like, this to me is really like a highlight of the ESOP advantage. In that, if you're a worker at a smaller company, you're much more likely to sort of have the benefits that you need to be a good worker. And that shows much more clearly that even when it's tougher to do it because you're smaller, ESOPs do it, and it pays off. And they also, many of them also offer a 401k plan, which we know from, which is also in line with what we know from ESOPs overall, is that they're often either have a 401k component in their KSOP, in their plan, or they offer a 401k that gives, allows for diversification for most of these workers. And as we've seen from in other sources, even those making less than $20 an hour, we still see an ESOP advantage in terms of the retirement benefits they have. And that's vitally important, since the median retirement benefits, or the median household retirement account, is 0 for Americans overall. Okay, so please do reach out if you have any questions at all. I think the overall finding here is that no doubt all businesses struggled and faced turbulent times during the pandemic. ESOPs are certainly not a silver bullet in any way. But clearly there's a pattern here. Clearly there's a solid statistical difference that we were able to find, and it kind of confirms what we know in our guts and what we've seen anecdotally, that there is this advantage, and it pays off for workers and employers.